In the forgotten outskirts of a southern town, where moss-draped trees whispered secrets to the wind, Marcus Deshawn lived quietly with his retired canine partner, Shadow, a German shepherd once hailed as a hero. Theirs was a life of silence, marked by routine and memory, until the morning Shadow failed to stand. What began as a simple act of concern spiraled into a dark unraveling, a courtroom betrayal, a forgotten truth, and a dog that had been silenced not by nature, but by design. What would you do if the one soul you trusted most had their memory stolen, and no one believed you? This is the story of a man, a dog, and a conspiracy buried beneath loyalty. Stay with us, like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. The rain in Atlanta was the kind that didn't pour, it pressed. Heavy, humid, slow. The kind that made everything feel closer, like the whole city was leaning in to whisper something you didn't want to hear. Marcus Mac Deshawn stood in the doorway of his shotgun apartment, arms folded, eyes fixed on the figure curled up at the far end of the living room. Shadow. His partner, his proof, the black and tan German shepherd was barely breathing, shallow gulps of air rising his chest like he was sucking oxygen through a straw. Mac's fists clenched. Just last week, Shadow had chased down a meth dealer across 2 blocks and leapt a chain-link fence like it was paper. But tonight the dog couldn't even stand. "Come on, buddy," Mac murmured, kneeling down beside him. "We got court tomorrow, you remember? You're the key witness." He tried to smile, voice light, but it cracked at the edges. He reached for his phone with one hand, stroking Shadow's flank with the other, dialing the emergency vet number for the 4th time in an hour. Still busy. A storm warning had blacked out half the city. Shadow didn't flinch, but his eyes flicked toward Mac, a flicker of recognition. Pain, trust, and something else, fear. Mac had seen that look before. In suspects, in victims. In the mirror, something was very, very wrong. By 2:17 a.m., the rain had stopped, but Mac's living room looked like a battlefield. Syringes, towels, water bowls, heating pads, and the silence of waiting. He sat on the floor next to Shadow, refusing to leave his side, and then the memory hit. 3 days ago, a man in a gray suit had brushed past them outside the courthouse. Shadow had growled. Mac hadn't thought much of it, probably just a scent he didn't like, but now that moment looped back in his mind, like a glitching tape. At 7:43 a.m., Mac walked into the courthouse alone, in his left hand a leash, dangling. No weight, no presence at the other end, just silence. "Where's the dog?" the prosecutor asked before the session began. His tie was too tight, his jaw too loose. "Still alive, barely," Mac answered, not bothering to hide the venom in his voice. "He was poisoned." "Can't prove that," the prosecutor muttered, flipping through his note. "And without the dog, we don't have the sequence." The judge entered. Everyone rose. The bikers sat at the defense table like a man watching reruns. Relaxed, cocky, wearing a denim vest covered in patches from a gang disbanded 3 years ago by a K9 raid. Shadow's raid. Versus Curtis Bones McGuire, the clerk announced. The trial lasted 21 minutes. The toxicology report hadn't come back yet. The surveillance footage that might have shown Shadow being tampered with had glitches. Mac's eyewitness account was dismissed as circumstantial. The biker's alibi, flimsy as it was, held up under lack of contradiction. And then the words fell like cement bricks. "The defendant is hereby acquitted on all charges." Mac didn't stand, didn't speak. He looked down at the empty leash, his hand shook. Then he stood slowly, nodded to the judge like a man in the eye of a hurricane, and walked out. By the time he got back home, Shadow was sleeping, breathing steadier now, but there was something gone in his gaze. The fire, the focus, the thing that made him more than just a dog. A knock on the door. Loud, sharp. Mac opened it to find a small box on the step. No note, no sound. He opened it. Inside, an empty syringe and a single patch, black with a red skull. That night, Mac sat next to Shadow, watching the city lights bleed through the blind. He wasn't angry yet. Not really. He was something colder, a quiet clarity that had no place in grief. He looked down at Shadow, still asleep, chest rising and falling like waves on glass. "I'm not letting this go," Mac said softly. "Not again." Shadow didn't move, but his tail gave a single twitch. Morning crept in slow. the kind of gray that seeps into your bones before you even step outside. Max stood in the backyard behind his small duplex, the Georgia air thick with dew and the faint smell of damp soil. The metal of the chain-link fence was cool against his hand, and Shadow, still recovering, lay quietly in his outdoor kennel, head resting between his paws. The same kennel he'd slept in for years, a space both sanctuary and stronghold. Max's eyes drifted over the area with that cop instinct that never really turns off. Every corner, every angle. Something in his gut itched like a whisper from a past life. He stepped off the porch, walking the perimeter, boots sinking slightly into the wet grass. The ground was uneven near the far end where the neighbor's overgrown bushes pushed against the edge of the fence. That's when he saw it, a flash of dull metal nestled in the shadows of the hedgerow. Kneeling down, Mac parted the thick foliage, his breath catching for half a beat. A used syringe, not one of his. He'd never leave that kind of risk anywhere near Shadow, especially not now. His hand hovered for a second before he grabbed a plastic bag from his pocket. Always carried one out of habit and carefully scooped the syringe inside. No label, no residue visible to the naked eye. But Mac had been around enough junkies and enough crooked labs to know this wasn't street-grade stuff. This was clean. Military clean. Clinical. He stood there for a moment, the weight of the bag feeling far heavier than its contents. His mind reeled back to the small box on the porch the night before, to the patch inside. Red skull, black thread. A ghost from a unit disbanded long ago. He headed back inside, eyes narrowed, fingers already dialing a number he hadn't used in over 5 years. "Jackson?" The voice on the other end answered, groggy but alert. Then, "Shit. Tell me what you've got." Within 2 hours, a black SUV rolled up behind Mac's garage. Out stepped Jackson Pierce, ex-military chem specialist turned freelance forensics analyst. No badge, no jurisdiction, just loyalty and knowledge Mac trusted more than any lab in the city. Jackson took one look at the syringe, whistled low, then pulled on gloves and popped the bag into a portable scanner. The hum of the device filled the silence as Shadow shifted slightly in his kennel, eyes following the stranger, ears half-pinned. But the dog had something's missing. The way he watches me, he should have reacted more. Mac said nothing, just stared. After a few minutes, the scanner pinged. Jackson frowned, pulled up the results, then blinked twice. "No way," he muttered. "What?" Mac stepped closer, tension radiating off his frame. "This compound, I haven't seen it since 14. It's a synthetic neuromodulator, used in deep obedience conditioning for Tier 1 K9 units, specifically engineered to scramble neural pathways tied to command recognition. Not kill the dog, just reset him, temporarily. Like wiping a drive." Mac's jaw tightened. "You mean it makes them forget?" Jackson nodded slowly. "Forget who gave the order, forget what the command means. Short-term memory, used to test re-imprinting response times. Effective, but controversial. Too many side effects. It was pulled from use by the Department of Defense almost 10 years ago. And yet somehow," Mac muttered, voice low, "it ends up in my backyard." Jackson crossed his arms, exhaling sharply. Someone with access to military-grade pharmacology, black market ties, or both. Mac turned to the window where Shadow now stood, tail limp, eyes still watchful but lacking that fire. The instinct to read a situation before a human even saw it. That was gone. And now he knew why. "You ever see this used in the field?" Mac asked. "Once," Jackson said. "German Shepherd. Unit in Kabul. Dog went from top-tier asset to docile in under 6 hours. Had to be retrained from scratch. Rumor was it was sabotage. Gambler died 2 weeks later in a so-called training accident." Mac's mind buzzed. The biker, the patch, the past. He moved to his old file cabinet, pulled open the lowest drawer, and flipped through records he hadn't touched since his forced retirement. They're photos from a bust 5 years ago. Operation Howl Howl. A weapons and drug ring run by former spec ops turned outlaws, operating under the radar using decommissioned military dogs as smuggling assets. The case had been buried under bureaucracy. Most of the suspects disappeared before trial. But one image stood out. A tattoo. Skull, red thread. Mac pulled it free, eyes locked. He wasn't just a street biker. He was part of this. Jackson leaned over the photo. That's your guy? Yeah, Mac nodded. And Shadow took him down in an alley outside Marietta. I testified. Shadow corroborated with a scent cue. McGuire got out on a technicality. He swore he'd return the favor. Looks like he did. Jackson glanced toward the syringe. Only this time, he didn't kill your dog. He erased him. Mac said nothing, but his hands shook as he filed the photo back in place. Where do we start? Jackson asked. Mac looked out at Shadow, who now sat watching them both, his gaze empty yet alert, like he was waiting for a signal he could no longer understand. We start with the supply chain, Mac said, voice a quiet storm. Someone had to source that serum, someone had to get it into my yard, and someone had to somehow get it to Chicago. Jackson cracked his knuckles. I'll get to work. But Mac was already grabbing his jacket. There were 3 names burned into the edge of his memory. Names that shouldn't still be alive, let alone walking free. And one of them had a warehouse just 10 miles west. The night stretched long and heavy over the house. The kind of stillness that wasn't peace but pause, like the whole world was holding its breath. Mac lay on the worn-out couch, one arm behind his head. Eyes open, staring into the darkness as the slow hum of the old refrigerator filled the silence. The investigation into the origin of the modulator serum had hit a temporary wall. No digital trail, no purchases on the dark net that matched its specific compound signature. Whoever administered it had gone analog, old school, probably military trained. But that didn't bother Mac. He'd been raised in analog. He knew where shadows hid when electricity wasn't enough to expose them. His mind was spiraling through the old files when he heard it. Not a bark, not a growl, a low, keening whine, then scratch, 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 slow, rhythmic, deliberate. He sat up instantly. Shadow. He was on the other side of the back door, not barking to go out like he usually would, not panicked. This was different. A pattern. 3 short scratches paused, 2 longer ones. Then a low growl that vibrated just enough to be felt, not heard. Mac's blood chilled. That sequence, it wasn't just random. That was a code, a behavioral imprint, a signal they'd trained for in 2016 during Operation Silent Coil, a multi-state weapons bust that went sideways in Savannah. Shadow had only ever used that scratch pattern once, during the perimeter breach of an arms facility, where one of the handlers had gone missing. Mac had found him half dead in a crawl space thanks to Shadow's alerts. It wasn't just a habit, it was a memory. A locked response pattern only triggered by a very specific combination of sounds and scents. Shadow was remembering. Mac crossed the room in 3 long strides and opened the door. Shadow stood just beyond the threshold, ears pinned, body tense, eyes wild with urgency. But not fear, recognition. Something had triggered a memory, and it was clawing its way back to the surface, through whatever fog the serum had cast over his brain. Mac stepped outside, barefoot, his soles meeting the cold wooden deck. Show me, he whispered, as Shadow turned without hesitation and bolted toward the northern fence line. Mac followed, adrenaline surging like a current. Shadow stopped at the far corner, nose pressed against the ground, tail split. Then, without warning, he began to dig, rapid, furious, obsessive. Dirt flew, clumps of wet soil sprayed onto Mac's jeans as he knelt beside him, shining a flashlight into the shallow hole. And then he saw it. A glint of brass, a casing, 308 round. Mac's stomach turned. This wasn't theirs, not from anything fired on his property. He reached down, wiped the dirt from its side, and noticed the scratch, a distinct diagonal gouge, like it had been ejected at high velocity and bounced off metal. His breath caught. He knew this casing, it was the same type used in the unsolved Sequoia Arms shooting 3 years ago. A cold case buried under bureaucratic rot and NDAs. A warehouse raid gone bad. Suspects fled. 1 canine was injured. 2 handlers killed. The only clue left behind was a set of tire tracks and a blurry security image of a man walking into the fire, with a rifle and a denim vest. Mac had stared at that image 100 times when the case passed across his desk during his last month on the force. He had never confirmed the ID, but the gut feeling had been real. The man walking into the fire was Curtis McGuire. Now that same exact casing was here, on Mac's land, and Shadow had found it by memory, not scent, not training, something deeper. Mac stumbled back to his feet, heart racing. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The serum hadn't fully erased Shadow. It had buried his instincts beneath layers of synthetic doubt, but the memories were still intact. Fragmented, raw, but there. The dog looked up at him now, panting, eyes locked on his. Mac whispered. Shadow whined softly, stepping forward and nudging the casing in Mac's hand. The night suddenly felt thinner, like something beyond the dark was watching, waiting. Mac picked up the round, turned it over, and then remembered something else. During the Sequoia incident, a biker gang was spotted transporting crates before the raid. One of them was marked with a red skull. At the time, no one made the connection. But now Mac couldn't ignore it. It wasn't just a coincidence. McGuire had been there too. This was a loop, a full circle. Mac turned back toward the house, but Shadow didn't. He just stood there, nose flaring, body angled slightly northeast. Mac followed his line of sight. Beyond the fence, in the distance, a small blinking light flashed once, then vanished. A drone? A signal? He didn't know. But Shadow had seen it first, and his body trembled. Not from fear, but from effort, like he was holding something in, something on the edge of erupting. Come inside, Mac whispered, but even as he turned, he knew Shadow wouldn't sleep again that night. Not while whatever memory had clawed its way up was still fighting for air. Mac returned to his files, spread across the table like shattered bones. He pulled out the report from Sequoia, page 6. Witness statement. The dog went silent, like it forgot what it was. Mac's phone buzzed. A text from Jackson. Need you to see this. Chemical structure matches a batch ordered by an inactive facility in Brunswick. Gov Shellcorp. Address incoming. Mac looked at Shadow, who had returned to the door, sitting quietly, eyes locked on him. Whatever had been triggered wasn't going away, and if his instincts were right, that facility wasn't inactive at all. The address Jackson had texted led nowhere, or at least, not yet. It was a dead end, buried behind layers of expired business registrations, closed tax IDs, and one disconnected phone number linked to a veterinary supply distributor that no longer existed. Mac paced the kitchen, knuckles raw from clenching, until his eyes landed on Shadow's file still lying open on the dining table. On the last page, handwritten in the margin from the courthouse logs, was a note: Shadow cleared for standby witness duty by Eastwell Animal Clinic, 7:35 a.m. Pre-count, evaluate response to check no one had, and he damn sure hadn't taken Shadow there. His hands moved before his mind caught up, keys snatched, coat half-zipped, Shadow already on his feet by the door like he felt the pulse of the hunt rekindle in Mac's blood. 22 minutes later, Mac pulled up outside Eastwell Clinic, a clean glass-fronted building with flower beds and a cheerful logo painted in pastels that didn't match the kind of place where a combat-aimed canine had been medically compromised. He stepped inside, Shadow close behind, and scanned the lobby. The receptionist, a young woman with a high ponytail and company fleece, flashed a professional smile that faltered when Mac's badge-shaded ID holder swung into view, though it no longer bore official weight. "Can I help you?" she asked, too quickly. Mac's voice was calm but loaded. "Marcus Deshawn. Shadow was seen here the morning of the Curtis McGuire trial. I'm following up." The woman blinked, hands faltering over the keyboard. "Right, yes, I think that was... Dr. Hayes handled that, but I wasn't working that shift." Max smiled faintly. "No problem. Pull the file anyway." She hesitated, clicked a few times, then frowned. Weird. His record shows an appointment but no exam notes. Just a check-in and check-out time, right?" She paused again. "We're not supposed to..." "I'm not asking for permission," Max said. She pressed her lips together and walked off. Shadow sat beside Max, boots like stone. When she returned, she handed over a slim folder and a USB drive. Mac thanked her and turned to leave but stopped when he caught something behind the front desk. A plaque, shiny, new, engraved in bold serif letters. Community Compassion Award. Donated by the Crimson Brotherhood Foundation. Beneath it, in smaller font, "In appreciation of your service to local heroes." Max stared. "When did you get this?" he asked, turning back. The woman flushed, clearly uncomfortable. Just a week ago, Mr. McGuire dropped it off. Said our work mattered." Mac's silence turned heavy. "Did he donate anything else?" "A grant," she admitted. "For equipment, New anesthesia machines. It's been tight lately with budget cuts. Mac nodded slowly, stepping back outside. The moment the door shut behind him, his hands flew to the USB drive, jamming it into his laptop. He pulled up the footage. Standard multi-angle lobby feed. Clean, ordered. Then he checked the timestamp. 7:32 a.m. A woman entering with a shepherd. No leash. Looked like Shadow, but something was off. His gait was too relaxed, as if sedated. The woman's face was obscured by a hoodie. She checked in, then disappeared behind the exam doors. Then black. A 3-minute cut. At 7:38 the feed resumed. Same woman, same dog. But Shadow was moving oddly. Slower, less alert. Almost like he was drunk. His fists clenched as he paused on a close-up. A mark on Shadow's left haunch. A tiny puncture wound, barely visible but unmistakable. The moment after the cut returned, the mark was there. Before the blackout, nothing. 3 missing minutes. Enough time to inject, enough time to alter everything. He traced the cut back using manudata embedded in the file. The footage had been manually edited. Not a server-side issue. Someone with physical access had intentionally deleted that window. He jumped out of the truck, marched back inside, and this time his voice didn't wait. I need to speak with Dr. Hayes now. She's not in until tomorrow. Then give me her number, I'm not playing. The receptionist hesitated too long. Shadow growled, low and deliberate. That did it. The number was scrawled on a sticky note and handed over with shaking fingers. Mac walked out, heart pounding, mind racing through every red flag he'd missed. He punched the number into his phone, but it rang once and went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same, then he pulled up Dr. Hayes' veterinary license online, still active. But no recent reviews, no public sightings, nothing since the date of Shadow's exam. Mac's next call went to Jackson. I need you to look into Eastwell's payroll and vendor lists. Look for anything tied to Crimson Brotherhood, or any shell orgs connected to McGuire. Jackson didn't ask questions. Give me an hour. Mac hung up and stared out the windshield, knuckles white around the steering wheel. Across the street, a man leaned against a light pole, pretending to scroll through his phone, but Mac's instincts flared hot. He knew a tale when he saw one. He turned the ignition, pulled out slow, then made a hard right down an alley. The man followed, casually but too perfectly timed. Mac circled 2 blocks, then parked in a delivery zone and stepped out. Shadow stayed low in the seat. Mac walked casually, looped behind the man's route, and when they crossed paths again, Mac grabbed him by the collar, slammed him into brick. Who sent you? He hissed. The guy stammered. I'm just a messenger. Wrong answer. Mac pulled his shirt collar aside, revealing a familiar tattoo. Red skull, black thread. Mac leaned in, breath hot. You tell McGuire this isn't over. He bought 3 minutes of silence, but I'm about to make sure the rest of his life is noise. He released the man, who staggered off without looking back. Mac climbed into the truck, heart pounding, Shadow watching him with renewed clarity. Jackson texted just then. Clinic received a $10.00 K-wire from Charon Outreach Services. 3 days before Shadow's exam, LAC registered under fake ID in Nevada. But the IP from setup bounced off a router in Brunswick, the same one tied to the facility we couldn't trace earlier. Mac stared at the message, then at Shadow. His voice was barely a whisper. They've done this before, and this time they weren't just covering a mistake. They were refining a method. The rain had returned, tapping softly on the windshield as Mac sat in the parking lot of a diner off I-75, halfway between Atlanta and the state line. Shadow lay curled in the back seat, breathing steady, head twitching every now and then as if fragments of his former self stirred inside a dream. Mac had spent the last 48 hours buried in case files, cross-referencing old K9 deployment reports with incidents involving unexplained command failures, missing animals, or handlers reporting sudden personality changes in their dogs. It was Jackson who found the first lead, buried in a 2018 court transcript from Montgomery, Alabama. Officer Kelly Ruiz, veteran K9 unit, had testified that her partner, a 5-year-old Malinois named Hero, had refused to obey a command during a warehouse drug bust. Hero had no history of failure, no health issues, no disciplinary record. The dog froze mid-mission, then bolted. Ruiz had been shot in the leg while trying to protect him. Hero was never seen again. Official report claimed the dog was likely spooked and lost in the chaos. Ruiz had argued otherwise. He had changed just seconds before. Blank stare, no recognition. Like a switch had been thrown. The case went cold. No suspect was ever convicted. Max scrolled through the photos attached to the case and paused on the image of the warehouse. Chain steel siding. Shipping containers stacked along the east wall. One of the containers bore a rusted logo barely visible beneath grime. A faded crimson insignia with twin serpents. Charon Freight Inc. Max's eyes narrowed. That name had appeared in Jackson's trace on the veterinary payment trail. Charon Outreach Services. Different suffix, same route, same shell. A coincidence that stank like gasoline near a lit fuse. He opened a separate file one Jackson had pulled together from a National Archive of Service Anomalies. Canine units whose records included phrases like, refuse to engage, uncharacteristic hesitation, or behavioral inconsistency under pressure. 8 cases spanning 4 states, all within the past 6 years. All written off as handler error, training fatigue, or trauma. But all had one anomaly in common. Each dog had been seen by a civilian-affiliated clinic or a temporary field vet no more than 72 hours before their incident. Every single one. Max's fingers flew across the keyboard as he pulled GPS logs and service maps, connecting dots between locations, shipment manifests, and vet visits. One particular cluster leapt out from the data. Shipments routed through a logistics corridor used exclusively by a now-defunct transport company, Black Mesa Hauling, which had declared bankruptcy in 2019 after a federal audit turned up incomplete manifests and unverifiable driver logs. Mac cross-referenced the haul routes with criminal activity timelines. The overlap was disturbing. Wherever Black Mesa trucks went, a spike in canine unit malfunctions followed. He leaned back, brain thrumming. Black Mesa had operated out of 3 depots: Memphis, Tallahassee, and a third near Savannah, Georgia. The Savannah site had burned down during a suspected arson 2 years ago. The others had been sold quietly to private buyers with offshore accounts. But when Mac filtered the employee records, one name appeared under the Tallahassee driver list: Curtis McGuire. Mac muttered under his breath, a curse too tired to be angry. He searched DMV logs, customs checks, even DOT incident reports, until finally he landed on a redacted field memo from a Florida task force on ferry. Claims of illegal animal transport involving modified military-grade sedatives, with Black Mesa flagged but dismissed due to insufficient evidence. The memo was dated 3 months before McGuire moved back to Atlanta. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't personal, not in the way Mac had first assumed. It was a pattern, a system. Mac dug deeper, pulling every vet license issued to clinics within a 100-mile radius of the old transport hubs. Some were clean, but 3 had received grants or renovation donations from a charitable group called the Brotherhood of Guardians. No website, no social presence, but on the legal filing listed under Primary Director C. McGuire. Mac stared at the screen, the same man who'd walked free in his courtroom, the same man who'd smiled when Shadow didn't bark. He felt the weight of years suddenly press down on him. This was a loop, a silent war against the animals trained to protect truth. Not just sabotage, systematic erasure. Someone was identifying key canine units, isolating them, injecting them with synthetic obedience-modifying compounds, and using shell corporations to funnel money into veterinary clinics who would either look the other way or participate outright. Mac knew the why now. Canines weren't just tools, they were witnesses. And unlike humans, they couldn't be cross-examined or bribed. But take away their ability to respond on command, and their testimony collapsed, just like it had in court with Shadow, just like it had in Montgomery with Hero, just like it would keep happening unless the pattern was broken. Mac opened one final file, a closed internal affairs report from Louisiana, flagged confidential. A German shepherd named Reza, partnered with Officer Darnell Boone, had failed to signal during a fentanyl bust tied to cartel shipments. Boone had taken his own life weeks later, and Reza had been found dead in a drainage canal. Autopsy inconclusive, but buried in the evidence photos was a snapshot of Reza's injection site. Same location, same pinprick mark, Mac felt the storm coming before he even looked up. Shadow had risen from the back seat and was now staring out the passenger window, ears rigid, tail stiff. The door creaked open before Mac could even speak. Shadow leapt out, nose high, body tracking something in the air. Mac followed as the dog cut through the side alley beside the diner, then stopped at a rusted dumpster. Shadow sniffed once, then twice, then growled. Mac approached and saw what had triggered him: discarded shipping labels, half-burned from a crate marked Sharon Logistics Organic Materials. Dated 2 weeks prior. Drop Point, Brunswick, same location as the Shell lab Jackson traced. Mac's jaw tightened. The net was tightening, and inside it, ghosts from every failed mission, every silenced witness, every erased truth were crawling their way toward the light. The engine purred low as Mac turned off the headlights and rolled the truck to a stop a quarter-mile from the compound. The GPS marked it as a decommissioned lumber mill, but local law enforcement had stopped patrolling the area after routine vandalism turned violent last year. In truth, the place was a known ghost cell for ex-biker militias off the grid, heavily guarded and surrounded by silence. Jackson's intel had tracked multiple supply drops from Sharon Logistics to this location over the past 4 months. Mac sat still for a beat, eyes on the flickering halogen lights dancing above the rusted rooftop. Shadow shifted in the back seat, low growl barely audible but steady. He knew. He always knew. Mac reached over, clipped a matte black tracking tag to Shadow's collar, then palmed the modified key fob that activated the jammer. "You signals in or out?" he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. "Let's go quiet." They moved through the trees, every footstep calculated. Mac had done this before: Afghanistan, Serbia, Venezuela. But this was different. This was home. And betrayal always smelled worse in familiar air. A chain-link gate stood ahead, partially open, wrapped in barbed wire that was more show than function. Beyond it, the main structure loomed like a sleeping beast: corrugated metal, shattered windows, and the faintest smell of old oil and blood. Mac moved along the perimeter, scanning for movement, but the place was unusually still. They slipped through a broken service door, stepped into a narrow hallway lined with busted lockers and faded gang insignias scrawled across the walls. Somewhere deeper inside, muffled voices faded behind a closed steel door, but Mac's focus snapped sideways as Shadow suddenly froze. Nose lifted, bridled Holly. Then he darted down an adjacent hallway, paused silent on concrete, leading Mac to a storage room. Shadow stopped at a pile of mildewed rags and sniffed, then pawed. A small square of fabric came loose, faded green, frayed at the edges, stained with old oil and sweat. Mac's breath caught. He knew that piece of cloth. It was a military-grade training towel, custom cut, used to send imprint commands back when Shadow was still green. He had a set of 5, each encoded with different tactile cues. Only 3 remained after a warehouse fire years ago. This one had gone missing during that fire, and now here it was, buried in a biker stronghold. Shadow whimpered once, then licked the fabric. Recognition. Pain. The training memory had survived the serum. That meant whoever had this towel hadn't just sabotaged Shadow, they'd studied him, targeted him. Mac tucked the cloth into his pocket and moved deeper into the building. The voices were gone now. Either the men had left, or they'd gone deeper underground. At the end of the hallway, behind an old workbench, a door stood ajar with faint light leaking through the gap. Mac signaled to Shadow with a 2-finger swipe, and they entered together, slow and ready. The stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into the belly of the compound, a sublevel that didn't appear on any of Jackson's maps. The smell hit first, not rot, not blood. Chemical sterility. Like a lab. The room below was larger than expected: concrete floors, old kennel cages along one wall, and floodlights illuminating what looked like training panels lined with mirror glass. The space had once housed animals. Maybe I still did. In the far left cage, a water bowl sat dry beside a worn blanket. Claw marks streaked the walls, deep, repetitive, desperate. Shadow approached slowly, sniffed the floor, then turned in a tight circle and sat beside the bowl. His body language shifted, not alert but mournful, as if the scent carried something too close to home. Mac moved to the workbench and found a thick binder half buried under dust. He opened it, heart pounding. Inside were laminated sheets diagrams of canine anatomy, response circuits, behavioral graphs. The logo at the bottom of each page, not Sharon but a black skull overlaid with a microchip marked CBR Unit 9.4, experimental reflex overdiagram. He flipped through the pages faster now, bile rising with every diagram. This wasn't standard canine training. It was manipulation, reversal protocols, condition response inhibitors, command nullifiers. They had rewritten the book on obedience, designed routines to undo instincts instead of reinforce them. One diagram showed a German shepherd hooked to a series of visual and auditory cues, each one progressively dulling the dog's reflexes until no reaction occurred, even under physical duress. Another page listed chemicals' handwritten annotations beside them, including the same compound Jackson had identified in the syringe found near Mac's yard. But what froze him completely was the final page. Subject name SJ3D/status. Partial wipe/handler M. Deshawn/phase 2. His breath hitched. Shadow had been part of their experiment log. Not by chance, not collateral, by design. They'd mapped his mind like a circuit board, tested thresholds, recorded failures. This hadn't been about silencing one witness. It had been a goddamn blueprint. He turned to Shadow, who now stood staring at the mirror wall. For a moment, Max saw the dog's reflection shimmer. Not in glass, but in memory. Training fields, summer light, a scent trail leading to a final command. Sit. And he had. Always. Until they took that from him. A soft sound echoed from beyond the far wall. A metallic click, faint but deliberate. Mac closed the binder, slid it under his jacket, and motioned for Shadow to flank left. They approached the wall slowly and found a thin seam in the concrete, barely wide enough to be a service access. The door opened inward. No lock. No warning. Inside, the space was darker, colder. A second chamber lined with more cages this time, all empty. Tags still hung from their doors. Razor. Mac raised his flashlight and caught sight of something embedded in the concrete. A chipped ID tag, half buried but legible. Wezadov Michela Moore Superhero Splash Tag Lee. Rezadov Boone Unit. The dog from Louisiana. The one who never came home. Shadow pawed at it, then froze, body stiffening. A second click echoed behind them, this time louder. Closer. Max spun, gun raised. The second metallic click reverberated through the chamber. Louder than before. Sharper, too precise to be mechanical error. Mac whipped around, flashlight cutting through the dark as his free hand gripped the pistol on instinct, eyes narrowing to isolate the source of the sound. Shadow tensed beside him, tail stiff, body low. His breath audible but steady. For a moment there was nothing but the echo of their own presence bouncing off the concrete walls. Then silence. Real, heavy silence. Max stepped toward the sound's origin. A steel vent barely larger than a shoebox, loosened from its mooring, swinging slightly from the ceiling. Above it, faint footprints marked the dust-coated duct. Too small for a grown man. Too wide for a rat. Someone had been watching. Recently. But whoever it was, they were gone now. Mac holstered his weapon, grabbed the embedded ID tag Shadow had pawed from the wall, and slipped it into his pocket, next to the binder. As they climbed out of the hidden chamber and emerged back into the upper level of the compound, Mac's mind was no longer spinning. It was tunneling. Fast, focused, controlled. Someone had orchestrated this from deep inside the infrastructure, and it hadn't started last week. Not even last year. It went back further. Possibly all the way to the early years of Shadow's training. As he crossed the threshold into open air, Mac's phone buzzed. Jackson. The timing was perfect. He answered without a word. I pulled the personnel archive you asked for, Jackson said. The original trainer assigned to Shadow during Phase 1 imprinting was Sergeant Owen Riggs, based out of Fort Eisen. I know Riggs, Mac muttered, walking toward the truck. He was quiet, smart, too good for the rank they stuck him in. He resigned 6 months after your unit was rotated stateside, Jackson continued, and 3 months later, vanished. Official discharge. Civilian re-entry filed, but no employment, no address, no bank activity. He just disappeared. Max stopped walking. Disappeared as in, no record? Greg's last requisition form before he left the service was for a compound labeled EXD42. There's no inventory match for it on DoD records, but I found a fragment of the requisition slip in a misfiled incident log. It's the exact compound we found in Shadow's bloodstream. Mac's chest tightened. The implications crawled under his skin like ice water. Are you saying Shadow was tested with EXD42 before we ever left the base? It's more than that, Jackson said. According to the form, EXD42 was requested for controlled response studies on advanced obedience assets. Your dog was part of a test program, one the brass buried. Mac felt his knuckles whiten as he gripped the door handle. So they used my dog as a lab rat before he ever saw the field, and then wiped the guy who filed the request. Not wiped, Jackson corrected. Just made to disappear. Mac climbed into the truck, Shadow jumping in beside him, and stared out at the skeletal remains of the biker compound. Every part of him now understood this wasn't about a single betrayal. It was an institutional one, and it went deeper than McGuire or Sharon or any gang in leather jackets. Shadow had been compromised before he ever took his first bite in the field. Mac remembered their first mission together. Shadow had signaled on it, and Mac had trusted that signal without hesitation. That instinct, that trust, had saved lives, and now he realized it might have been built on a lie. As he drove, the rain returned light at first, then heavier, drumming a chaotic rhythm against the windshield. Mac pulled over at a roadside rest stop and opened the binder again. He flipped to a section labeled Pre-Deployment Evaluation Protocols Eisen Unit K9. The pages were coded militarious formatting, but the annotations had been added later in darker inhuman handwriting, precise, unflinching. Under subject SH3D, which he now knew was Shadow's early identifier, a line had been underlined twice. Response to XD42 within acceptable latency. Reflex override achievable in less than 7.5 sec under simulated duress. Memory reformation is stable but incomplete. Mac read it again. Slower. Then again. Shadow hadn't just been given the drug, they'd measured how long it took to break him, how quickly they could rewire his instincts, and they had deemed the results acceptable. It explained everything: the subtle behavioral inconsistencies during late-edge missions, the occasional delayed response, which the trainers had always chalked up to fatigue or stress. Mac had believed them, trusted them, because he trusted the system, and the system had betrayed them both. He turned the page and found a reference to Phase 2 assets non-military deployment potential, with crossheads to external contractors. One was circled, BMH Logistics Division, Black Mesa Hauling. The bikers had never been the origin. They were distribution. Somewhere, someone higher had pulled the trigger on XD's civilian deployment. Mac closed the binder slowly, pressing his fingers to his eyes as the weight of it all pressed down. The missing trainer, the buried records, the staged failures, the silence. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the steering wheel, as Shadow laid his head on Mac's knee, warm and steady. For a long time, neither moved. Then Mac's phone lit up with another message from Jackson. "Check your email, I found Riggs." "Maybe." Mac opened the encrypted app and saw the photo. Grainy, surveillance footage. A gas station outside Baton Rouge. A man in a hoodie buying dog food and syringes. The face was mostly obscured, but the build, the posture, it looked like Riggs. And next to him in the frame, a German shepherd with mismatched ears. The timestamp was only 2 days old. Mac stared at the screen, his pulse accelerating, his voice a whisper in the dark cab. "He's alive." Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching, as if he too had heard something on the edge of memory. Mac started the engine again, headlights cutting through the fog. The road ahead was uncertain, winding into shadow. But this time, there was more than revenge fueling him. There were answers waiting, and somewhere beyond the static, the man who'd first trained Shadow might be the only one left who knew how to undo what they'd done. The road to Baton Rouge bled into morning haze, each mile a mix of cracked pavement and boiling thoughts. Mac barely noticed the shifting light outside the truck windows as he reviewed Jackson's grainy surveillance stills again and again, memorizing every detail of the man's posture, the faint scar under his left ear, the way his left foot slightly toed out Riggs' signature stance. The man was alive. Shadow sensed it too, his behavior sharpening, his nose often pressed to the edge of the cracked glass, ears twitching at roadside noise. They were both running on instinct now, but instincts didn't prepare Mac for what hit his phone next. A breaking news alert popped up as he crossed into city limits. Bright red and heavy with insult. Brotherhood Biker Club holds memorial for K9 hero in honor of courtroom drama. Mac clicked the link, his grip on the steering wheel tightening with every word. The video was already viral. Dozens of leather-clad bikers had gathered on a makeshift stage outside a sports bar off Jefferson Highway. They'd erected a comically oversized dog statue with sunglasses and a police badge collar. The banner read, "Rise Shadow Fallen Comrade. Confused K9 forever forgiven." Curtis McGuire stood center stage, one hand wrapped around a mic, the other gripping a red Solo cup, laughter bubbling from his throat like gasoline on fire. "We may not all be cops," he said into the mic, "but damn it, we respect loyalty. And this dog, this brave, brave dog, he did the only thing no one else in that courtroom had the guts to do." He stayed silent. Laughter erupted. Max stared, mouth drawn tight, knuckles pale against the steering wheel. In the crowd, journalists chuckled. Online influencers snapped selfies. No one questioned the cruelty. To them, it was parody, viral fodder. But to Mac, it was war. They'd turned Shadow's trauma into spectacle. They'd painted him the one soul who'd never betrayed anything as a punchline. Worse, they'd made Mac look like a man chasing ghosts. "Disgraced ex-cop crashes again," one tweet read, followed by a meme of Mac's face photoshopped over a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist. Shadow whined quietly in the back seat, sensing the tension. Mac pulled over into a hardware store parking lot, threw the truck in park and took a breath. Then he opened the glove box and pulled out a small device. His old backup recorder. Analog. Untraceable. Something every real cop carried before the cloud turned memory into Maddock. The night before, Jackson had sent a text. "McGuire's memorial is a show, but it's also bait. Get close. He'll say more than he means." Mac hadn't replied. He didn't need to. Now he clipped the recorder to the inside of his jacket and stepped out of the truck, Shadow leashed beside him. They weren't going in through the front. They were going in quiet. Around the back of the bar, the music thumped loud rockabilly tracks, harmonicas, thundering bass. Mac moved behind the dumpsters and slipped into the rear service door just as a waitress stepped out for a smoke. Inside, the air reeked of spilled beer and sweat. Voices echoed through the building, but Mac's ears tuned only to one, McGuire's. He was off age now, in the VIP section of the bar, his voice booming through a circle of drunk sycophants. Mac slid into the shadows near the doorframe, slipped his phone into his pocket, and let the recorder run. McGuire laughed again, louder now, words slurred but clear. "Y'all think I'm some monster for messing with a dog," he said, raising his cup. "But hell, I didn't kill it, I just made it forget. That's all it takes sometimes. Take a memory, shake it up, and poof, loyalty's gone. No need for bullets." One man chuckled nervously. "But he almost died, right?" McGuire waved dismissively. "They never die. These dogs are trained to survive the worst. Makes them perfect for our kind of work. What I did? That was mercy." "It's true, you dosed him before the trial?" McGuire grinned. "Didn't have to, we had a vet do the hard part. All legal, all clean, no residue." The mutt walked in like he'd never smelled me before. Mac's jaw clenched, his heartbeat a steady hammer. The words were gold. Proof. But then another voice asked, "And the cop?" McGuire scoffed. "He's too broken to matter, the man's chasing shadows literally. Let him run his little crusade. Every step he takes, he discredits himself more. You know how the system works. One barking ex-cop doesn't scare anyone, especially when the dog doesn't bark with him." He didn't need a confrontation. He had what he came for. Back in the truck, he rewound the tape, replayed the clip, voice steady over the hum of traffic. "I didn't kill it, I just made it forget." Shadow sat up straighter as the recording played, ears rising. He stared at the dashboard, then at Mac, then back at the sound as if he too understood the weight of those words. Mac reached back, laid a hand on Shadow's head, and said quietly, "You didn't forget. You survived it." He texted Jackson, "Got him. Audio confession, vet connection confirmed. Moving to next phase. Regs is still the key." Jackson responded with a single link, a secure file drop. Inside was a redacted dossier pulled from an old defense contractor archive. Project Helix, Behavioral Override in Tier U Canines. Oversight, RT Briggs. Status, discontinued. Personnel was a lawsuit. A rural shelter. A name Mac hadn't seen in years. He stared at it, pulse rising, and somewhere beneath that text, buried in the document code, was a note. Handwritten, scanned. If he remembers, I failed. If he forgets, I succeeded. But if he survives, he'll find me. Mac looked over at Shadow, who was still staring at the dash, still alert. And somewhere deep inside both of them, the thread between memory and truth tightened one more knot. The sun hadn't risen yet when Mac parked the truck in the gravel lot of the animal shelter on the edge of Livingston Parish. The facility looked like it had been stitched together from scavenged lumber and fading government grants. An old tin roof, warped wooden sign, a gate that hung crooked on rusted hinges. But this was the place. Jackson's coordinates had led him here, and according to the file embedded in the Helix dossier, Riggs had last used this location's mailing address to apply for a veterinary supply shipment months after his supposed disappearance. Mac didn't call ahead. He rarely did. He stepped out into the cold morning air with Shadow at his side, the leash barely taut, the shepherd more focused than he'd been in weeks. There was clarity in the way he moved now. Purpose. And though his gait still held a faint hesitation from weeks of neurological disruption, something deeper was reawakening beneath his ribs. They walked through the gate and knocked on the weather-beaten door, where a sign read, "Closed" in faded chalk. Moments later, it creaked open, revealing a woman in her mid-40s, dark circles under her eyes, hands stained with iodine and ink. Her name tag was flipped backward, but Mac already knew who she was. Dr. Celia Rourke. She looked at him for a beat too long, recognition flashing first in her pupils, then shame. "You're Deshawn," she said. "Come in, quickly." Mac stepped inside without a word, and Shadow followed. The shelter smelled of bleach and linoleum and quiet regret. She led them to a back office filled with dog crates, medical posters, and a mini fridge buzzing under a counter. Her fingers trembled slightly as she closed the blinds. "I knew you'd come eventually," she said, voice soft. "That dog shouldn't be walking." Mac said nothing, just watched, listened. "Wait." She swallowed hard and turned to a small lockbox beside the fridge, retrieved a narrow vial, and held it out like it burned her palm. "EXD-42, she said. "I didn't know what it was when they gave it to me. Said it was just a sedative, temporary. But then I started asking questions, and the threats came." Mac took the vial, held it to the light, saw the viscous fluid shimmer faintly amber. "Why are you giving this to me now?" he asked. "Because I didn't give it all," she replied. "I was supposed to inject the full dose, but when I looked into his eyes," she glanced at Shadow, "I couldn't do it. I gave him less than half, enough to fog him, not erase him. I'm sorry, I didn't know what else to do." Mac's voice was ice. "You had a choice." "I chose to live," she snapped back, then softened. "But now, if they find out I talked to you, they already know," Mac said, "and I'm betting they're watching this place." She nodded. "Then, we don't have much time." Mac pocketed the vial, snapped a photo of the serial code, and turned to leave. But before he reached the door, she added, "He'll come back. Piece by piece. His brain's reconfiguring faster because you trained him on loops. Memory loops. Sense sound off reinforcement. That's the only thing EXD can't fully break: muscle memory wrapped in emotion." Mac paused. "What's the trigger?" She looked at Shadow, then at Mac. "You." Outside, the morning fog had thickened, swallowing the road in white silence. Mac drove through it slowly, digesting everything, replaying her words. The bottle sat on the dash, glinting cold and dangerous. Shadow rested with his head on Mac's lap, tail occasionally flicking, eyes half closed. But as they pulled into the safe house garage back in Baton Rouge, something shifted. Shadow sat up suddenly, body stiff, nose pointed toward the workbench near the far wall. Mac followed his line of sight and saw nothing unusual, just his gear. A few stacked boxes, a worn duffel bag he hadn't touched in weeks. But Shadow moved, fast, ears pinned, breath sharp. He went straight to the bag and began pawing furiously at the zipper. Mac opened it. Inside, folded beneath old flannel and ammo pouches, was a denim biker vest, one of McGuire's, kept for scent tagging during early stages of tracking. Mac hadn't thought about it since, but Shadow had. The moment the vest came free, Shadow lunged. Not in aggression, in recognition. He buried his nose into the fabric, sniffed deep, then snarled. Deep, raw, the kind of sound Mac hadn't heard since Fallujah. Shadow backed up, hackles raised, tail rigid, then lunged again, biting into the cloth and shaking it violently. Mac dropped to one knee, heart pounding. "Is it him?" he asked, voice barely audible. Shadow froze, looked up, then barked 3 short bursts, one long. The confirmation code, the same pattern used during target identification drills. Mac stared. For the first time in weeks, the dog was responding with absolute certainty. No fog, no hesitation, just instinct. Truth, memory. Shadow dropped the vest at Mac's feet and sat, panting hard, gaze locked on the door as if expecting the target to walk through at any moment. Mac picked up the vest, eyes narrowed. The label inside read Maguire, stitched in faded red thread. Shadow hadn't just recognized the scent, he'd identified the man. No longer passive, no longer confused, he was back. Mac grabbed the recorder again, replayed the clip of McGuire's voice. "I just made it forget." This time, as it played, Shadow barked once. Short, sharp, disapproval. Mac smiled, teeth tight. Not anymore. He clipped the vial to a reinforced case and texted Jackson, "Partial dose confirmed, dog responding. McGuire ID verified. Phase 3 begins now." Jackson's reply was instant. "Copy. Also Riggs made contact. Location trace shows static cabin northwest of Atchafalaya Basin. You'll want to hear what he has to say." Mac pocketed the phone, stared at the vest, then at Shadow. "He tried to wipe you," he whispered, "but you remembered anyway. That means they failed." Shadow nudged the door. "Ready?" Mac opened it, adrenaline rising again. This time they weren't chasing ghosts, they were hunting them. The courthouse looked the same as the day it broke. Columns tall and indifferent, marble cold underfoot. The flags outside fluttering with ceremonial ignorance. But this time, Mac didn't enter through the front. He came through the service corridor beneath the west stairwell, using an old maintenance badge Jackson had pulled from archived municipal contracts. Inside his jacket was the audio confession from McGuire. The vial of diluted EXD-42 sagged with a forensics affidavit, and a court-ordered petition for retrial, quietly pushed through a sympathetic appellate judge 2 days prior. But it wasn't just paperwork that mattered today, it was memory. Shadow padded silently beside him, tail low, breath steady, body tuned like a loaded spring. His eyes were clear, alert, alive. In courtroom C3, the atmosphere was different than last time. Fewer reporters, less noise. But McGuire was there, seated cockily with a new lawyer, acting like he still owned the room. He didn't notice Mac slip into the gallery. He didn't see Shadow until it was too late. The judge, an older woman with sharp features and a voice like dry gravel, called the session to order. "We are here to reconsider the admissibility of evidence presented in the matter of the People v. Curtis McGuire. Mr. Deshawn, you may proceed." Mac stood slowly, every eye turning toward him. He held up the recorder. This audio was captured during a public event hosted by the defendant. In it, he admits to orchestrating the sedation of a government canine prior to sworn testimony. The audio played. McGuire's voice spilled into the chamber. "I just made it forget. Didn't have to kill it." Gasps rippled through the room. But Mac wasn't done. "Your Honor," he said, turning to Shadow, "with your permission, I request a demonstration of behavioral recall from Shadow. It may provide clarity as to what was lost and what's returned." The judge hesitated, then nodded. Mac reached into his bag and pulled out a sense sample, the same biker vest Shadow had targeted back at the garage. Then he gave the hand signal. Shadow's response was immediate. His body went rigid. Ears perked. He circled once, then paced toward McGuire's table. At 6 feet, he stopped, barked once, sat, barked again, then slowly lay down. Paws extended exactly as he had the morning of the original attack. The courtroom froze. Even McGuire tensed. Mac took a step forward. This behavior sequence was trained as a silent identification cue. Bark once for visual match, sit for scent lock, second bark confirms. Final laydown signals certainty. It's what he did the morning of the incident. What was struck from the record because they said he malfunctioned. He didn't, he remembered. McGuire stood up suddenly, waving his hands. This is ridiculous. That mutt was high. He was twitching in the hallway before court. The judge arched an eyebrow. Mr. McGuire, that detail was never included in the public transcript. How do you know what the dog looked like before court? Silence, like a blade slicing air. McGuire's mouth opened, then shut. I meant, he stammered. I saw footage, the judge said, eyes narrowing. Security recordings were corrupted. That's why testimony was deemed unreliable. Max stepped closer, voice calm. You weren't watching footage. You were watching him, while your vet pumped him full of X-Exit. McGuire turned pale. His lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously, but it was too late. The judge slammed the gavel once and secured all parties involved in veterinary administration. Chaos broke across the room. Reporters scrambled. Lawyers shouted. But all Max saw was Shadow, now standing calmly beside the bench, tail wagging once, eyes fixed on the judge like he understood it was over. 2 weeks later, in the same room, a ceremony was held, quiet, formal. Shadow received full reinstatement honors as a decorated canine officer. His badge was returned, his name cleared, the incident rewritten not as failure but as survival. Max stood beside him, chest straight, suit pressed. He didn't smile, but his hands stopped shaking. Outside, under a silver sky, Shadow trotted ahead off leash for the first time in months, then turned, barking once sharp, strong, true. Mac followed, slowly, surely, because justice, when it came, didn't come easy. But it came. A gangler of young men filled the doorway. One turned to gasp at his. If this story moved you, consider giving it a like and subscribing to follow more cinematic stories like this one. I'm curious what part of Mac and Shadow's journey hit you the hardest. Was it the betrayal, the comeback, or that final twist in court? Let me know your thoughts in the comments and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Let's keep this conversation going.